Okay, so picture this. It's 1877, and a backroom political deal doesn't just decide who the next president is. It basically slams the door shut on one of the most incredible, most transformative periods in all of American history. I'm talking about Reconstruction. So today, we're going to unpack that very deal, the Compromise of 1877, and figure out how it completely changed the course of the nation. So how does a whole nation just abandon a cause like that? I mean, Reconstruction wasn't just some set of policies on paper. It was a real promise, a promise of a brand new, more equal nation. So how did that promise get so completely broken? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect storm of political burnout, a total economic collapse, and a really violent counter-revolution. All right, so to really get the compromise, we have to rewind just a little bit. Because by the early 1870s, the whole foundation of Reconstruction was already starting to crumble. You could just feel that the North's will to actually enforce civil rights down in the South, well, it was fading, and fading fast. And a big part of that was a major shift happening inside the Republican Party. I mean, this was the party of Lincoln, the champions of abolition and civil rights, right? But now, a really powerful group inside the party, the stalwart Republicans, they were just getting tired. After a decade of struggle, their focus started shifting away from the high ideals of civil rights and more towards the, practical stuff like the booming industrial economy and, frankly, just holding on to political power. And you can't overstate how critical this shift was, because without the full power of the federal government behind it, the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection under the law, well, it started to feel like an empty promise. The truth is, the U.S. never really sent enough people down there to restore order and make sure the rights of Black Southerners were actually guaranteed. And then, as if things weren't already shaky, this massive economic shockwave hits the country. A huge financial crisis just erupts, and it completely takes over the national conversation. Whatever idealism was left, yeah, this just shattered it. So the whole thing kicked off in September of 1873. This massive financial firm, a company called J. Cook and Company, just suddenly goes bankrupt. And that sent immediate shockwaves rippling through the entire economy. And look, this wasn't just some minor recession. We're talking about a crushing 6-year-long depression. All the credit just dried up, landowners couldn't pay their bills, and for a lot of workers, especially in the South, it created this horrible cycle of endless poverty called debt peonage. Basically, they were trapped, forced to work just to try and pay off debts that they could never, ever escape. All of this economic turmoil, of course, fueled a ton of public anger. You had things like the Tompkins Square riot in New York City, where more than 7,000 people were out on the streets demanding jobs, only to be met with brutal force by the police. When a nation is so completely consumed with just trying to survive economically, that political will to keep doing the hard work of Reconstruction, it just disappeared. So while the North is completely distracted by all this economic chaos, down in the South, a really smart and frankly ruthless political movement saw a golden opportunity, and they grabbed it with both hands. They called themselves the Redeemers. Now, it's important to note these weren't the same old pro-slavery Democrats from before the war. These guys were different. They called themselves New Departure Democrats, and they talked a modern game, focusing on stuff like business and trade. But they had one single key promise: to restore home rule to the South. And let's be clear, home rule was just code for one thing: putting white Democrats firmly back in control. And you know what? Their strategy was incredibly effective. I mean, by 1871, they had already taken back control and ended the Republican-led Reconstruction governments in Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. The momentum was building, and it was building fast. But listen, their strategy wasn't just about making promises of a better economy. Oh no. In states like Mississippi, they rolled out something called the Mississippi Plan. And it was a brutal, organized campaign of violence and fraud. The whole point was to intimidate Black voters and activists, to physically and forcibly crush their political power. So, all of this is what sets the stage for the presidential election of 1876. Just think about it. You've got a North completely distracted by a massive depression, a South that's roaring back to life using violent political tactics, and a whole nation just on edge. It was the absolute perfect recipe for a constitutional crisis. So, the race comes down to two guys. On the Republican side, you have Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio. His whole campaign is about fighting corruption and fixing the economy. He barely even talks about Reconstruction. And in the other corner, you have the Democrat, Samuel J. Tilden, governor of New York. He's running on a platform of honest government and, you guessed it, home rule for the South. And the election turns out to be ridiculously close. I mean, it all comes down to the electoral votes from just 3 southern states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And in all 3 of those states, conservatives use that same playbook of violence and fraud to keep people from voting, which just threw the results into absolute chaos. So now you've got a total mess. Both parties are claiming they won in those states. To try and sort it all out, they create a special electoral commission. But instead of coming up with some fair solution, it just becomes a purely political fight. They vote strictly along party lines, 8 Republicans to 7 Democrats, and they just hand all the disputed votes and the entire presidency to the Republican Hayes. Well, as you could imagine, the Democrats were absolutely furious. They started threatening to boycott the inauguration. There was even talk of setting up rival governments. It felt like the country was on the brink of another huge conflict. So, to avoid that, politicians from both sides started meeting behind closed doors, trying to figure out a way to defuse the situation. And what they came up with is what we now call the Compromise of 1877. It was a classic backroom political deal, and the terms were pretty straightforward. The Democrats agreed to let Hayes be president, and in return, the Republicans promised to pull all the remaining federal troops out of the South, and they'd throw in some economic favors, too. And that right there, that was the moment everything changed. In April of 1877, the brand new President Hayes made good on his promise, and the last federal soldiers packed up and left the South. And when they left, so did any real enforcement of federal laws and any protection for Black citizens. The Redeemers, they now had total, unchecked control. And the results were just immediate and so stark. You can see it right here in this table, just how fast those conservative Redeemer governments took over. Look at South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. The takeover happened in 1877, the exact same year the troops left. The Compromise of 1877 really was the final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. So in the end, when you put it all together, the economic crisis that totally changed the country's priorities, and this political deal that yanked away federal protection, it meant that the most revolutionary, most important goals of the entire era, they were just left behind, completely unfulfilled. Look, the Compromise of 1877 did what it was supposed to do. It stopped another immediate national crisis from exploding. But in doing so, it made a trade. It traded short-term political peace for the long-term abandonment of federal oversight in the South. And that set the stage for decades of segregation and disenfranchisement. It really makes you stop and think, what's the real long-term cost of a political compromise?